I still remember the morning the new prisoners arrived. The mist was lying low over the camp, a pale gray sheet that softened the edges of the watchtowers and turned the razor wire into a line of silver thread. I had been up since before dawn, checking the kitchen, counting the coffee tins, making sure the breakfast line would start on time. The war felt far away here in the middle of the country, but every truckload of prisoners that rolled through the gate was a reminder that the fighting was still chewing through Europe, and that somehow pieces of it had drifted all the way across the ocean to this quiet patch of farmland. I was 27 then, working as an interpreter and clerk for the army. My German was decent, learned from my grandmother, who had never quite lost her accent. When the first transport women came in, the officers asked if I could help with paperwork and orientation. Most of our prisoners were men, thousands of them scattered across the Midwest in barbed wire villages. But this small group of women was different. Nurses, clerks, auxiliary staff who had been swept up as the Allied lines advanced. There were maybe 30 of them, thin, pale, travel-worn. The bus that brought them in rattled like an old can. When the doors folded open, I caught a wave of cold air mixed with the sour smell of diesel and wet wool. They stepped down one by one, blinking against the brightness. Some tried to look straight ahead. Others looked down at the ground. One of the guards shouted an order, and the women lined up quickly, their movement stiff from a long ride. I stood by the gate with a clipboard, watching. A few of them couldn't have been more than 20. One, with a braid the color of straw, kept her chin lifted, as if daring the whole camp to prove her wrong about what she had been told to expect. We had heard the stories of what the German prisoners thought of us. Their propaganda claimed Americans tortured captives, starved them, used them for labor until they dropped. The truth was simpler and duller. We followed the Geneva rules, and we fed them better than most civilians in Europe were eating by that point. Still, when the women saw the camp buildings, wooden barracks, neatly painted numbers, even a small chapel, they looked confused, as though they'd stepped into the wrong kind of prison. Processing took most of the morning. I translated questions, handed out forms, explained the rules in careful phrases. No violence, no escape attempts, respect the guards. They nodded, murmured ja or versti. What struck me most was how quiet they were. The men we'd processed before usually came with noise, jokes, grumbling, a kind of rough bravado. These women barely spoke. Only their eyes moved, darting around, taking the fence line, the towers, the distant patch of cornfield beyond the camp road. By mid-morning, the kitchen was alive with sound. Pots clanged, the old stove hissed and spit. Ruth Caldwell, our head cook, was already frying bacon by the time I came in to check the breakfast list. The smell was unmistakable, rich, salty, the kind that sneaks under doors and wraps itself around your thoughts. It filled the mess hall, seeped through the open windows, drifted toward the yard where the new prisoners were standing in formation. I remember thinking that the smell alone could make a man forget the war for a few minutes. Outside, the women were still waiting to be assigned barracks. I saw them lift their heads almost in unison, like a flock of birds catching the same current. One of them whispered something to another, and they both half smiled, half frowned. It took me a second to realize what they were reacting to. They could smell it, the bacon, the coffee, the bread warming on the griddle. I walked over the fence line and heard one of them say softly, "Speck, rakes du das?" The words sounded strange in her mouth. A memory awakened. For years they had lived on rations. Turnip soup, ersatz coffee, bread mixed with sawdust. Bacon had become a rumor. And here, on the first morning of captivity, the air was thick with it. I could almost see the disbelief cross their faces. One young woman, Greta I later learned, covered her mouth as if she might cry. Another whispered, "They feed that to prisoners?" I pretended not to hear, but the question stayed with me. When the guards finally marched them toward the barracks, the smell followed, teasing them. I heard the squeak of boots on gravel, the rattle of canteens. The sound of frying never stopped. For the rest of the morning, the camp felt strangely alive, as though the smell itself was some invisible signal that normal life still existed somewhere beyond the war. By noon, I was back in the mess hall, helping Ruth arrange the serving line. She was a stout woman with arms strong enough to lift a kettle in each hand, and she treated every batch of food like a small rebellion against misery. They may be prisoners, she told me once, but they're still human and hungry as hungry. She ladled eggs onto trays, lined up stacks of toast, poured coffee so dark you could lose a spoon in it. Outside, the women waited, still unsure what kind of welcome this was. When we opened the doors, the smell rolled out like a wave. I stood by the entrance to translate instructions. The women filed in slowly, eyes wide, silent. You could hear the hum of the stoves, the crackle of grease. Ruth said, "Good morning, ladies," and though most didn't understand the words, they caught the kindness in her tone. I watched their expressions shift, from suspicion to confusion to a kind of fragile relief. Greta was near the end of the line. When she reached the trays of bacon, she froze. She stared at it as if afraid it might vanish. Ruth looked at me and said, "Tell her to take some." I repeated it in German. Nehmen Sie. Es ist in Ordnung. Greta hesitated, then picked up a single slice, almost reverently. She held it for a second before setting it on her plate. As they sat down to eat, the room went quiet. Forks scraped softly against tin. Some of them ate quickly, eyes lowered. Others took small bites, tasting slowly. I could see tears starting in the corners of a few eyes. For months, maybe years, they had lived on scarcity, and now the enemy was feeding them abundance. It was too much to understand all at once. I carried a pot of coffee from table to table. When I reached Greta's group, she looked up at me. Her English was rough, but she managed, "Why, you give us this." I said the first thing that came to mind, "Because you're here and it's breakfast time." She didn't know how to answer. She nodded, looked down, and kept eating. I thought about what they must have imagined before arriving. Torture, starvation, humiliation. Instead, they found hot food, clean beds, and guards who mostly kept themselves. It wasn't kindness, exactly. It was procedure. But sometimes procedure feels a lot like mercy. The next morning, the smell returned. Bacon again, mixed with coffee and flour dust from pancakes. The women lined up without being told. A few even managed small smiles at the guards. When I greeted them, Hannah, the nurse who acted as their unofficial leader, said, "It smells like home, but also not." I asked what she meant. She searched for the English. Home was hungry. This smell is before the hunger. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. Days passed, and the novelty of food didn't fade as quickly as I expected. Every breakfast drew the same quiet amazement. They learned the English words of meals, bacon, eggs, coffee, toast, and used them with shy pride. Some began helping in the kitchen, peeling potatoes, washing trays, even baking bread under Ruth's supervision. I heard laughter sometimes, thin but genuine. It felt strange, hearing laughter from those who had once worn the enemy's uniform. One afternoon, a few of the women were assigned to work in the vegetable garden outside the fence. The guards kept a careful distance, rifles slung loosely, but the tension had eased. I was nearby, checking inventory. Greta found a wildflower growing by the fence and picked it, tucking it into her pocket. She saw me watching and said in halting English, "For the cook, for bacon." I smiled and told her Ruth would like that. That night Ruth found the flower on her kitchen table. No note, just a stem in a tin cup. She looked at it for a long time before saying, "Guess they found their way to say thank you." Neither of us mentioned it to the officers. Some things didn't need official reports. Weeks turned into months. The war ended in Europe, and rumors spread that the prisoners would be sent home soon. Some were eager, others were afraid. I could see it in their faces. Fear of returning to ruins, to hunger again. The camp, for all its fences, had become a strange kind of refuge. One morning, as summer faded into early fall, Hannah approached me after roll call. She asked if she could write to her family in Hamburg. Regulations allowed censored letters, so I brought her paper and pencil. She sat at a small table in the mess hall, thinking for a long time before writing. When she finished, she handed it to me to translate for approval. The first line read, "We are treated well. This morning we had bacon." She underlined the word as if it carried more meaning than any other. I realized then how deeply that simple smell had settled into all of us. To them it meant warmth, safety, maybe forgiveness. To me it meant normalcy, proof that we could still hold on to decency even in wartime. It was just breakfast, yet it had become a quiet symbol of humanity. The weeks after Hannah's letter passed quietly. Routine had taken hold of the camp. The morning roll call, the hiss of the kitchen stoves, the distant sound of trucks on the highway. Most days felt the same, yet something subtle had changed in the air. The guards no longer shouted as much. The women no longer flinched at every order. Work details went out on schedule, and in the evenings they gathered under the low eaves of the barracks, talking softly in a mix of German and broken English. I often sat outside the office after supper, coffee mug in hand, watching the sky fade from gold to violet. Some nights I would hear singing from the women's compound, old folk songs, lullabies, things I didn't understand but could feel. The harmonies carried over the wire like threads connecting two worlds that were supposed to hate each other. One night, Ruth joined me on the steps, wiping her hands on a towel. "You notice how quiet it's gotten?" she said. I nodded. "They're starting to feel safe," she went on. "That's when the missing starts." I asked what she meant. Once people stop being afraid, they remember what they lost. She was right. You could see it in the way Greta stared off toward the horizon sometimes, her mind far across the ocean. As autumn deepened, the shipment of supplies changed. Less bacon, more powdered eggs, wartime stocks winding down. The first morning the kitchen ran without bacon, the women noticed immediately. There was a faint disappointment, like a melody cut short. I told them the war economy was shifting, that ships and trains were being rerouted. Greta smiled faintly. "Maybe good," she said. "We go home soon, yes?" I didn't answer. None of us knew the exact date. When the orders finally came through, I helped the officers prepare the paperwork. Repatriation. Each name on the list felt like the closing of a chapter. The day of departure was bright and cold. The women lined up by the gate again, as they had on that first morning, though now their faces were fuller, their eyes clearer. Ruth brought out one last breakfast. Somehow she had saved a bit of bacon and fried it herself before dawn. The smell drifted over the yard, rich and familiar. Every head turned. Hannah looked at me and laughed softly. "You make farewell with smell," she said. I told her it seemed the right thing to do. When they boarded the trucks, a few waved. Greta pressed her hand to her heart, then to her mouth, as if sending the scent back toward us one last time. After they were gone, the camp felt hollow. The mess hall echoed. The stove hissed with no breakfast waiting. I stood in the doorway, breathing in the faint ghost of bacon that lingered on the walls, and thought about all the fear that had arrived here and all the small mercies that had left. War, I learned, doesn't always end with silence or parades. Sometimes it ends with a smell, one that reminds you what being human still feels like. The camp did not close right away after the women were repatriated. There were still men's compounds, still shipments to process, still forms to fill out in triplicate. But to me, it felt quieter in a way that went beyond the usual end-of-war calm. The laughter that had drifted from the women's barracks at dusk, the soft murmur of their songs, even the sound of their clogs on the gravel, all of it had faded like a dream you try to hold on to after waking. I went about my duties, though something inside me had changed. Before their arrival, I had thought of prisoners as a category, not as people. They had been faceless entries on a ledger, uniforms and serial numbers. But I could still see Hannah's steady gaze, Greta's cautious smile, Ruth's big hands sliding bacon onto their plates. It all came back in flashes. The way the smell of frying would drift through the morning air, the moment the women realized they would not be starved or beaten, the fragile gratitude that replaced their fear. A month later, I received a letter from the repatriation office. Inside was a smaller envelope, forwarded from Germany. The paper was thin, written in careful handwriting that I recognized immediately. It was from Hannah. She thanked me and Ruth, and everyone at the camp who had shown them what she called the gentleness of strength. She wrote that Hamburg was in ruins, food was scarce, and that sometimes when she walked to the empty streets, she would close her eyes and imagine that smell again, bacon, coffee, and bread, as a reminder that compassion could survive even in ashes. I read the letter aloud to Ruth that evening in the kitchen. She listened quietly, stirring a pot of beans on the stove. When I finished, she nodded and said, "You see? That's why you treat folks right, even when the world's gone wrong." She folded the letter carefully, slipped it into her apron pocket, and went back to stirring. I think it gave her something to hold on to. Winter came early that year. The fields around the camp turned white, and the guards walked their rounds wrapped in greatcoats. The mess hall stayed warm, the stove burning steady. Sometimes, when I came in before sunrise, Ruth would already be there, frying a little bacon even if there were only half a dozen people left to feed. "Can't start the day without it," she'd say. The smell filled the room, and for a few moments the war felt far away again. As the months passed, the army began shutting down camps one by one. By spring, we knew ours would close too. The day the order arrived, I walked the perimeter fence one last time. The wire glinted in the sun, harmless now. Beyond it, the cornfields were coming back to life. I thought about how many people had stood on the other side of that fence, wondering if they'd ever see home again, and how something as simple as breakfast had bridged that gulf, even if only for a while. When the last guards left and the gates were locked, I stayed behind to finish the paperwork. The barracks stood empty, the bunks stripped, the flagpole bare. I walked the mess hall, breathing in the ghosts of all those mornings. The clang of trays, the murmur of foreign voices, the laughter that had once sounded like a secret. On the counter, I found Ruth's old apron folded neatly, and beside it, a tin cup with a dried flower inside. It was the same kind Greta had picked months before. Somehow it had survived. I stood there for a long time, listening to the silence. Then I stepped outside, closed the door, and watched the smoke from the kitchen chimney drift upward until it vanished into the sky. The air smelled faintly of wood and salt and memory. And though the world was moving on, part of me stayed there, in that quiet camp, on that morning when the smell of bacon turned strangers into human beings again. Years passed before I spoke much about the camp again. After the Army released me, I went back to civilian life, found work in a small-town office, married, raised children. The war receded into the background of everyone's lives, turning from an open wound into a scar we simply learned to live with. But sometimes, when I stood in my kitchen early in the morning and heard the first sizzle of breakfast, it all came back. The pale mist above the barracks, the echo of foreign voices, the astonishment on a young woman's face when she smelled bacon for the first time in years. For a long time, I kept Hannah's letter folded inside a book of family recipes. Every few months I would take it out, read it again, and wonder whether she was still alive somewhere in that broken city she had written from. The letter grew soft with the creases, the ink fading, but the words still carried that same quiet gratitude. It reminded me that even in the middle of history's darkest storms, ordinary kindness could become something extraordinary. Ruth passed away in the early 50s. At her funeral, I placed a single wildflower on the casket, the same kind Greta had once given her. It felt right, like closing a circle that had started in that noisy kitchen years earlier. When people asked later how I had known Ruth, I told them we had served together during the war, and that she had fed people who didn't think of her as a friend. I never told them more. The story felt too delicate for casual retelling. But I never forgot the women who passed through that camp, nor the way the world had looked through the fence on those mornings. Time has a way of softening memory, yet certain images stay sharp. The way the frost caught the wire, the way the smoke curled up from the stovepipe, the way the guards' boots crunched on gravel, while the smell of breakfast made its own silent argument for mercy. Many years later, long after Europe had rebuilt itself and the camps had been reduced to nothing but foundations buried under weeds, I drove back to that part of the country. The road was different, new asphalt, new signs, but I recognized the shape of the land. The old gateposts were still there, rusted and half swallowed by vines. I parked the car and walked through the field until I found the place where the kitchen had stood. There was nothing left but a patch of wildflowers, the same kind that had once grown along the fence. I stood there for a long time, listening to the wind move through the grass. If I closed my eyes, I could almost hear the clang of the mess hall door, the hum of voices, the faint hiss of the pan on the stove. I could almost smell it again, that unmistakable blend of salt and smoke that had meant home to so many people, even when home was only a memory. For years, I wondered what difference any of it had made. Feeding prisoners didn't end the war. A few slices of bacon couldn't change history, but maybe in a small way, it changed the people who were there, them and us alike. Maybe that's how peace really begins. Not with treaties or flags, but with small gestures that remind us we're still human. When I finally turned to leave, the sun was sitting behind the trees, painting the sky in gold and ash. The wind carried the faintest scent from a farmhouse nearby. Someone cooking breakfast or supper, as people sometimes do. I smiled at the thought. The smell drifted across the field, familiar and warm, and for the first time in many years, I felt the same quiet peace that had filled the camp on that first morning. I realized then that stories like ours don't truly end. They fade, they rest, they wait, until something as simple as the smell of bacon wakes them again and reminds us of the better part of ourselves. And so I keep the memory close. Not the fences or the fear, but the faces, Hannah's, Greta's, Ruth's, and the mornings when, despite everything, we all remembered what it meant to be human.